pleasure to be here today and to be able to interact with many of you throughout the day. My talk today is going to be about thinking about social media and other similar platforms of social engagement that are becoming more and more popular, and thinking about what would be ways for us to use them as a sensor of our health and well-being. So I'm going to talk about several projects in this domain, and as I go through them, I'm going to sort of bring to the fore the opportunities that lie using this kind of a new source of data, and also the challenges that come with it. Okay, so I guess I don't need to spend much time telling you that social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook are ubiquitous. More and more people are adopting these platforms over several years now, and they're using them to not just seek information about what interests them, but also to share information about small and big happenings in their lives. So for instance, the birth of a child, moving to a new place, or visiting Stanford. So over the years, a new field has emerged. We call it the computational social science. It has both computer science and social scientists on board, but the common goals in this space is often to take this rich stream of data and try to bring them to bear on understanding human behavior, human moods, human emotions, and so forth. So the question arises, what kinds of attributes of human behavior can this kind of data tell us? It ranges from our emotion, it goes to our social interactions or how we talk to other people on these platforms, and also we can get a peek into the language that people are using to interact and express emotions on these platforms. So when we put all these attributes together, what can we do? We can do a lot of things, ranging from predicting the elections to the stock market, but what I'm going to talk about today is how can we use that to reason about our mental health and well-being. So the question arises, why mental health, right? So mental health is a kind of concern that we face that relates to our behavior very, very deeply. There are other motivations to look into this space. It's a significant public health challenge as well. As you can see on this map, it affects almost all countries of the world. And what makes it more challenging is that it's a kind of a health challenge that is considered to be socially stigmatized. That is, people are not comfortable talking about this challenge with others. This makes identifying people with these kinds of challenges really, really difficult. So most of the statistics that you would hear about mental illness, like depression and suicide, are actually severely underreported. So we were thinking, can we actually bring some of these new forms of data which are being generated in a naturalistic way? People are already on these platforms talking about what is going on in their lives, and use those data in ways that can give us a peek into this very important health challenge. The short answer is yes, and throughout the rest of the talk, I'm going to tell you how to go about it. So this is kind of the general structure. We are going to first look at different problems that touch on the opportunities that lie in using social media content and computational approaches to reason about well-being. So the reasons someone might be interested to do that is because it can help in early diagnosis. We can think about building risk detection or early warning systems that can tell us who is likely to have these challenges going forward. We can also think about new forms of interventions that could leverage platforms like social media to provide therapy or social and emotional support to those who are struggling with these challenges. And finally, none of it is without challenges. So we are going to talk a little bit about the different forms of privacy, ethical, and policy-related challenges that lie in this field when we are trying to bring a sort of non-conventional source of data to bear on a rather sensitive challenge of human life. So the first project I'm going to talk about, and a couple of them going forward, looks at these different major life events that happen, that a lot of us experience, and to think of social media as a way to see how behavior and people's emotional and mental health challenges shift around those events. The first event that I'm going to talk about is the birth of a child. The birth of a child is a very, very significant event that affects many of our lives. It is also an event that a lot of us take to social media to talk about, to announce that someone had a child in their family. So we wanted to sort of use this life event to understand and reason about the kinds of shifts that new mothers experience, and how we can glean those changes using Twitter data. We started by looking at new mothers who reported on Twitter that they just had a child. For that purpose, we looked at specific structures of birth announcements that we bootstrapped from a set of newspaper articles. So typically when people are announcing childbirth, they mention the name of the child, the gender of the child, how much the child weighs, what is the size of the child, and so forth. So we looked for those linguistic constructs in Twitter data to identify who could potentially be announcing childbirths. And then we applied a gender classifier on top of that to identify who likely were females. And as a third step, we brought in some crowd workers to identify if these are actually the mothers who were reporting the birth of their child, instead of, let's say, the grandmother or the aunt or a female friend. Following that, we collected the entire timelines of the set of new mothers from Twitter data. The question was, now using all this data, how do we quantify behavior? So we came up with a number of different measures. Our measures spanned 4 categories. To start with, we looked at different measures of activity on the platform. So for instance, their volume of activity, how socially interactive they were, how much they engaged in sharing external information, whether they were asking questions on the platforms, and so forth. We had 2 measures of the egocentric social network of the mothers given by the number of followers and followings on Twitter. We had 4 measures of affect, or more broadly, moods that were expressed through the tweets. So our first 2 dimensions were positive affect and negative affect. You can broadly think of them as positive or negative sentiment. And then we had 2 other dimensions of affect. Activation, which measures the intensity of the emotion, and dominance, which measures the controlling power of emotion. So for instance, both sad and angry are negative emotions, but angry has more dominance and more activation compared to sadness. Then we had our 4th dimension of behavior change, and that related to the style of the language that manifested in the posts from the new mothers. Style in psycholinguistics and social linguistics is identified to be a really, really important construct that actually signals about people's social environment and how they're experiencing emotionally and psychologically. So for that purpose, we looked for the mentions of different types of function words, like use of pronouns, use of articles, conjunctions, prepositions, and so forth. So it's the kind of words that you would actually throw out in any kind of text mining task. This is what we found. There are a number of charts here. Each of them corresponds to one behavioral change measure that I just described. There are 2 lines in each chart. In red, you have the mothers. In green, you have what we call a background cohort, but you can think of it as a control group of Twitter users who were women but who did not report giving birth to a child. There is a vertical line in blue at the middle of each chart. That is the reported time of childbirth. So we align all the mothers based on the reported time of childbirth across a period following the report of childbirth and an equally sized period before. The summary here is that the mothers actually show a pattern of behavior that is quite different from what you would see for the background cohort. So for instance, they are less active, but that kind of makes sense. They're busy. They just had one of the most major life-changing events, so they're probably not on Twitter, right? But then if you look at some of the other measures, you would see that they're less positive in general, they're more negative, and they're using more first-person pronouns. There are two questions that arise here. The first one is, are these changes that we are noticing, is it more specific or marked for a subset of the new mothers? And secondly, what do these changes actually mean from a psychological, from a health and well-being standpoint? To answer the first question, we looked at individual level changes to identify if there are certain mothers who change a lot more compared to others. We found that the answer is yes. So these are heat maps on two different measures, positive affect and activation. So it's an RGB scale, which means that red means larger values, blue means very small values, and green means anything in between. There are a small subset of mothers who are expressing less positivity in the time period following childbirth, and their emotions are also less intense. We used some statistical testing to identify effect sizes of these changes. And we came up with three categories of changes that the mothers are expressing. First one are the mothers who change a lot. So they are the mothers with large effect size changes. Then there are the mothers who only change a little. That is the mothers with small effect size changes. And then we have the control group, remember? So we wanted to see broadly how the languages are changing in general over the postpartum period compared to the prenatal period. The table that you see on top says the number of unigrams or single words present in the tweets that are changing significantly over the postpartum period compared to the prenatal period. And you would notice that that fraction is over a quarter for the mothers who change a lot. It's smaller for the mothers who only change a little. And actually, it's really small for the control group.
Just to clarify, this is the delta in the vocabulary?
This is the delta in the vocabulary. Yeah.
The control group that you referred to, I mean, a lot of this depends, of course, on the control group being very similar to the treatment group of pregnant women to make these quasi-causal comparisons.
Right.
How did you achieve that?
So we try to control for as many variables between the control group and the mothers as possible. So for instance, we looked at females. We couldn't validate the age, so age could be widely different, but I would imagine that the age range of Twitter users are fairly tighter compared to the general population. We controlled for locations wherever that we could infer that. So we tried to match the cohort of mothers as closely as possible to the control group so that these changes are not due to other kinds of confounding factors.
Could you have timelined it? Just like look at the same person the year before or something?
So we tried, these people are also the ones who posted about the same time frame as the new mothers. So that there isn't like, yeah, so like, for instance, the control group is not like someone who posted today and the mothers from 3 years ago, because there could be Twitter changes over time. So try to make sure they're the same time period as much as possible. Of course, the limitation is that someone actually could have had a child, just did not report it on Twitter. But you can think of it as a way to study people who do take onto Twitter to talk about life-changing events. Okay, coming back to the slide. What are some of these top changing unigrams, right? So if you see the table below, it gives you some examples to get some qualitative feel of what are the unigrams that are changing a lot. So if you would see these unigrams on the very right side of the table, these are the unigrams which are usually emotional in nature. And in fact, the positive emotion unigrams are actually dropping in their usage in the postpartum period compared to the prenatal period. So then we wanted to sort of think about ways that we can actually use language as a way to distinguish between different classes of mothers? And if so, is there a span of language that would distinguish these mothers from the others?
One question before you get there.
Yeah.
As well. I'm just wondering about the theory that's guiding this. You have this small effects and large effects, which is largely dominated by the statistical difference you're seeing. Sort of what's the mechanism that's going on here? Like, what is someone with a large effect? What does that mean versus someone who has a small effect?
So it just means that their language is shifting a lot.
So why is my question?
I'll get to that in the next couple of slides. So yeah, so the elephant in the room still is, why are these changes happening, right? Is that your question, Michael?
Yeah, roughly. Like,
yeah.
Why this division as opposed to any other? Like, well, large effects versus small effects is one potential way you could cluster, but you could imagine clustering on any other kind of change that you might have evidenced, or clustering on some difference that the theory in that field would have given you. Say, look at people who had previous issues with family depression or something like this.
Yeah.
This seems, as stated right now, I don't know where the theory is coming in.
Okay, yeah, I hopefully can answer that going forward. So we came up with a method we call the greedy differencing analysis, in which our idea was to identify what was the span of language that distinguished the mothers who changed a lot from the others. So how this method worked is we started with the top changing unigram, and we iteratively eliminated one unigram at a time and computed the language distance between the mothers who change a lot to the mothers who change only a little and the control group. So what we found through this task is that after elimination of a little over 1% of the unigrams, the mothers who change a lot became similar in their linguistic expression to the mothers who only change a little. And in fact, with the elimination of a little over 10%, they became similar in their linguistic expression to the control group. So we wanted to sort of think about what do these changes mean and why are these shifts happening, right? So we talked to some social workers, colleagues of ours. This was when I was at Microsoft, so we reached out to UW and talked to some social workers there. And they told us to look into the domain of postpartum depression. And they pointed us to look at language literature where it has been found that language could be a pretty powerful indicator of mental health challenges of people. So clearly, there are implications of this kind of an analysis for the well-being of individuals. But what is missing here is that we don't actually know if these individuals were suffering from postpartum depression and what some of these changes actually mean. So we went on to our second study, in which we wanted to collect gold standard information. We ran an online survey in which we gave participants who would be new mothers this questionnaire. So it's known as the Patient Health Questionnaire 9. It's a very well validated instrument that is used in the psychiatry space to assess mental illness in individuals. In fact, if anyone goes to a psychiatrist for help, this one, or there are a couple others like that, would be the first thing that they get and serves as a starting point for them to get an assessment of their challenge and to get onto treatment. For those new mothers, we went on to get access to their Facebook feeds as well, if they would consent to. This gave us 50 weeks of prenatal data going backwards from the reported childbirth and 10 weeks going forward. We had a sample of 165 mothers for whom we had assessments of their mental illness based on the questionnaire we saw on the previous slide, and also their Facebook data. We borrowed the behavioral change measures that we saw for the Twitter study in the context of Facebook, A, for generalizability, and B, to also kind of more deeply go into looking at the social aspects of these changes beyond the linguistic aspects. Because one of the cues that we found in the literature was the lack of sufficient access to social support for individuals who had some form of mental illness. And Facebook, being the kind of platform it is to help us towards improved social capital and so forth, we wanted to see if we would noticeable changes in access to social support and capital for the cohort of mothers who had postpartum depression challenges. So we use the behavioral change measures to train regression models. Our baseline regression model used the 50 weeks of prenatal data to assess the risk of postpartum depression that the individuals had reported. Our second model added 10 days of postnatal data to that, then 20 days and 30 days, and then we had a last model which used the 30 days of postnatal data alone to predict who would likely have postpartum depression. And I'll tell you why we chose those models. So two of the other things that we also found in the postpartum depression, or pretty much any mental health literature you would see, is that future mental illness is often very well predicted by past mental illness. And they need not be the same kind of mental illness. So for instance, literature says that mothers who have postpartum depression tend to also have some other kind of mental health challenge in the past. So the reason we are using the 50 weeks of prenatal data is to be able to capture some of those cues if there was historical evidence of some kind of mental health challenge in the past that would give us a signal of a similar kind of challenge resurfacing going forward. So now the question is why 30 days and all those other numbers in between, right? So this was the second thing we found in the postpartum literature. And that was that it typically onsets a month or two after the birth of a child, typically when the baby blues have worn off. So most mothers experience baby blues, and that's just a part of this whole experience. But some mothers would continue to have these blues going forward, which often manifests in the form of clinical depression. So we wanted to see that are there cues in this little phase right after childbirth when the mothers are going through these blues that could be potentially predictive of postpartum depression going forward. The best performing model that you would see here is the model where we have the 50 weeks of prenatal data and the 1 month of postnatal data added to that. That explains more than 48% of the variance in the data. So that tells us that there are these cues in the activity and in the social interactions and the emotions people express on social media platforms that could potentially tell us who could be at risk for a mental health challenge. There are many opportunities and to how this kind of a finding might be used, and it goes back to some of the ones that we laid out earlier in the talk, which is it can enable early diagnosis. We can think of self-reflection or other early warning systems that could make the mother self-aware that they might be at risk of a type of behavior that deviates from their past behavior, and they could act on that information by reaching out for social support or talking to someone they feel comfortable with, or even if necessary, reach out to their caregiver or doctor. The opportunities we realized are not just limited to these personal experiences of life-altering events. Our other work has shown that events that happen in the environment or the society that someone is immersed in can also be associated with the kinds of mental health related expressions we can glean from social media. So some of our other work has shown that people in Mexico who have been experiencing violence due to the drug war have shown markers of affective desensitization. Essentially, when violence was going up in those regions, over time we saw a decrease in the expression of negativity in the Twitter content. in one of our more recent works, we also found that experience of violence in cities can have some association with the kinds of emotional expressions that we can see on social media platforms, particularly Twitter. So we looked at a city that has experienced urban violence significantly over the years, that's Atlanta, and we looked at the expression of emotions, particularly negative affect, anger, and anxiety in the tweets in Atlanta, and tried to see how previous exposure to urban violence affects or predicts these types of emotional expression. Okay, so now we'll go forward, and I'll tell you a little bit about the possibilities of thinking about not just individual level assessments of mental health challenges, but what can third-party organizations do with this kind of new source of data. So we wanted to see if we can assess population scale characteristics of this mental health challenge. So for that purpose, we utilized a recruiting strategy in which we leveraged Amazon's Mechanical Turk. We gave the crowd workers, again, a standardized survey, this time a different one, CESD, which is a different instrument that has been validated in international context. So the PHQ-9 that we saw earlier is more kind of like a US instrument that is more popular in the United States, but CESD has been widely used in other cultures too. And given the known demographics of Mechanical Turk at that point in time, we thought that was more appropriate. This was sort of the breakdown. We had fairly equal number of males and females in our data. And we asked them if they would share their public Twitter handle with us. Then through those handles, we went back an year to get all of their Twitter data backwards from the date of reported onset of depression. So we also asked them if they had depression, and if so, if they have an approximate knowledge of the onset of that condition. We looked at a much wider set of variables this time to see markers, what correlated with depression. Notably, we included a measure we call the insomnia index, and that comes from observations in the literature that says that individuals with mental health challenges tend to be more active on the internet during the nighttime. We had more sort of deeper measures of the social graph. We looked at clustering coefficient, we looked at reciprocity and other network level features to see how they're related to depression. And then we had, among the language measures, we had something we call the depression lexicon, which was a set of tokens or unigrams, bigrams, and trigrams that were obtained from a forum in which depressed individuals went to get support. So that would give us some information about broadly about the kinds of things that individuals with depression would talk about. Yeah.
I want to understand the insomnia index more. It's interesting. So what you did is you calculated the mean, the sort of per user of when their post per hour, and then you broke that out by hour of the day, and you looked at the z-score per hour of the day. And then, so later what you're going to do is you're going to take like 2 a.m. and then look at the z-score there as a feature?
Yes.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm quickly going to go over those findings. So we had very similar observations as we had for the postpartum depression study. So the insomnia index was kind of interesting. This is what you have here. These are the hours of the day. And the depressed class, you would notice that just the raw number of posts per hours fraction normalized is higher later in the night and early in the morning than during the day. We also wanted to see if we could come up with some kind of an index that would tell us about the levels of depression in communities or populations over geography. So here on the left, you have actual data that is reported by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention through technically an annual survey, but honestly, the last one I think that happened was in 2010. That's called the BRFSS survey. So it assesses the prevalence of different mental illnesses in the population. And on the right, you have the predicted levels in the different states of the United States using the social media depression index. And what we find is that there is a reasonable amount of correlation. Not just a replication of these statistics, but we were able to also glean a little bit deeper to see demographic differences or geographical differences in the manifestation of depression. So for instance, differences in how men and women experience these things as gleaned from Twitter, and also seasonal effects in different cities for reported levels of depression as measured from Twitter. Okay, so I'm going to go forward and I'm going to talk a little bit about the third types of opportunities that exist. Yeah.
The onset of depression, because it's really a hard question. Depression could have started very early, and diagnosis usually takes too long, and usually people who are diagnosed with depression, they have been suffering for a long time. So it's not clear to me what the onset of depression means on your study.
Yeah, so it's kind of rough term. So we found that we phrased it as any point in time when they knew that they were having depression. To most people, it was the formal diagnosis, but from some of our other work, we have found that it could also be because they had another mental illness in the past, and they kind of knew that, okay, I'm probably experiencing depression now. And that might happen sometime before a formal appointment with a clinician. So it's a rough term. We wanted to get a sense of their own awareness of this condition, because we thought that the data going backwards from there could have cues that would have predicted this event. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about, so far we have seen like individuals who may be at risk of this challenge going forward and how we can bring social media to bear on that, thinking about these predictive models. But there is also a second part to it, which is the individuals who know that they are suffering from a mental health challenge, and they're coming to social media because they're trying to seek help or to connect with other individuals who are like them. So we wanted to see what is the potential of thinking of social media as ways of interventions or as ways of psychotherapy going forward. So there is actually a rich literature in HCI and other related fields that says that reveals how the value that online communities have in improving efficacy of individuals and helping individuals suffering from a health challenge go through that. So we borrowed from that literature and we started to look at these forums on Reddit, especially, where individuals are coming to get help and support on mental health challenges. In particular, we started to look at this forum called the Suicide Watch. It's a public forum. It's pretty dark. I wouldn't encourage you to go there and look for posts. Here's just some examples. But this is a pretty serious place on Reddit where individuals come when they're actually thinking of ending their lives. Throughout Reddit, this particular subreddit is recognized as a place where you go looking for support when someone is thinking about suicide. So now, you know, the question is, of course, what are the linguistic and other characteristics of suicidal ideation? And you can think of using this kind of data to build classifiers for that. But there is a deeper question there, which is that by the time someone is on these platforms, it's kind of pretty late already, because they're already thinking about these kinds of damaging thoughts. How can we preempt this process and maybe utilize social media and computational methods to go more upstream and identify those individuals who are likely to go to this forum going forward? This comes from the mental health literature, where it has been found that 80% of attempted or completed suicides come from individuals who have some form of mental health challenge in the past. But the reverse of it, which is anyone with a mental health challenge like depression, a very small percentage, fortunately, actually go on to die by suicide. So we wanted to see if there could be ways to discover these shifts over time. So this is one of our upcoming Chi papers, and what we did was to look at mental health forums on Reddit and look at the Suicide Watch forum over time, over a large period of time, and build a computational approach that could predict these shifts. But of course, it's very important to tease out causal, correlational and causal effects in these kinds of questions, because potentially a lot of the language that you would see in the Suicide Watch forum and the mental health forums are similar. Like depression is a common word in both those forums. So that's not a significant distinguishing attribute. We borrowed from the causal inference literature for the method that we developed here. Particularly, we used propensity score matching that I'm going to talk a little bit about going forward to identify these shifts. This was how we collected the data. So we had the mental health subreddit data to start with. We observed that data over a period of time. We made sure that we separated out two classes of people who had posted on Suicide Watch already and those who did not. Those who did not, we went on to observe them for a period of time, and that was kind of our ground truth for individuals who went through those shifts versus the others who did not. So for propensity score methodology, we looked at every single token in our in the content that is shared on the mental health forums, and we estimated the difference in probability of their usage in the two cohorts. That is the ones who went on to post on Suicide Watch going forward, and the ones who did not. So there were some pretty interesting findings. So I'm going to skip here, and if you see some of these words or unigrams on top, you would notice that, for instance, the usage of the word depression, although very common in both cohorts, its usage, the treatment effect of that token was 30% higher, or its usage was 30% higher in the individuals who went on to post onto Suicide Watch versus the ones who did not. Similarly, the use of the word useless was 50% higher in the cohort who went on to post on Suicide Watch versus the others. You will see many other tokens over here, like no friends, anxiety, loneliness, alone, which kind of signal at the social and the emotional experiences of individuals who are known in the literature to go on to think about suicide going forward. Utilizing these findings from the previous step, we built a classifier to be able to predict who would be likely a person who would show this shift or transition to Suicide Watch going forward. And we had a pretty reasonable accuracy identifying those two classes. So I think the opportunity, we believe, lies in sort of preempting this process of identifying communities or sets of people who might be at an elevated risk of suicidal ideation going forward versus individuals who have mental illness but are probably not going to be thinking about suicide going forward. And it's powerful because, unfortunately, most of the work on suicidal ideation, the data comes from cases where individuals have already died by suicide or who have attempted to suicide, which is already, it's definitely late for the former case and probably pretty late for the other one too. So looking at social media, we can think of these cues that relate to the ideation process much, much earlier than the traditional approaches to do so. In the interest of time, I'm going to talk very quickly about interventions, right? So it must be on the back of your mind all this while that, so what? What can we do with this new kind of data? The answer in many cases is interventions. And honestly, we are not the first ones to think about that. There are people out there who already have been thinking about interventions using the internet or using these online platforms. If you would search for suicide, which I don't recommend, but if you do, this is what you'll get, an 800 number, which is the suicide prevention line. If you go onto Facebook, they have rolled out a new suicide prevention tool as of last year, where someone could report if they see one of their friends experiencing a kind of challenge that deviates from the ordinary or deviates from their otherwise baseline behavior, and Facebook would send an anonymous message to that individual, giving them access to some resources like hotlines. Similarly, Instagram has banned certain types of hashtags that it doesn't feel aligns with their policies, and Tumblr shows what are known as public service announcements, or PSAs, when people search for types of content that could be dangerous to themselves or to other people who are reading them. So there are two problems in this kind of an approach. First of all, they're very blanket or umbrella in nature. They could apply to anyone. So they don't actually know if this person really has a mental health challenge or not. And secondly, the Facebook one, for instance, it leverages the social network of the person, and there could be all kinds of norms, expectations, and comfort levels that could affect whether your friend is gonna report someone in their network to be experiencing a problem or not. But the deeper question is the effectiveness of these interventions. And one thing that we wanted to examine is that, are these kinds of blanket interventions any effective or not? What we found is that for certain kinds of mental illnesses, especially eating disorders, there exist these communities on social media that glorifies the adoption and the maintenance of these challenges. So essentially, they promote behaviors that would situate eating disorders as a legitimate lifestyle choice instead of a mental health challenge that needs attention. These communities, we found, are subverting the kinds of interventions that Instagram has put in place to curb the propagation and sharing of these behaviors. So what we found is that individuals are coming up with lexical variations of the tags which Instagram has banned to continue to share pro-eating disorder type of behavior or type of content. So these charts show you that over time, the extent of variation of the banned tags has been increasing. And what we also find is that for at least several of these banned tags, the activity that exists on Instagram in the period after the banning was introduced is actually higher compared to that before, because these individuals are now adopting a number of different lexical variations to continue to share these kinds of dangerous behaviors that they wouldn't otherwise probably have if they only had this one hashtag that is now banned. The picture is very complex, right? So what do? I mean, we are seeing that there are these individuals who are coming to these platforms, some of who are probably looking for help. So there are individuals who are sharing pro-eating disorder behavior, but they realize that they need to change. And they're looking for help on these platforms, but now there's no way for them to share them through regular tags, so they have to go through these channel of using variations to reach out to these otherwise fringe communities on Instagram. So we need to think about new ways of intervening and helping people. And the question arises is that what would be those ways of intervening and helping? It of course depends on the individual. It also depends on the platform. As we saw that all these different platforms have different ways of intervening, so we have to think about ways of how to reach different types of people on different kinds of platforms, and how can we bring social media to bear on helping us devise those interventions. But broadly, the take-home message is that the cues that we can glean from social media can be really powerful in helping us guide these decisions that would go into interventions or designing these risk discovery systems or these early warning systems relating to someone's mental health behaviors. But one of the challenges, of course, is the privacy and the ethical angle, right? We have so far looked only at public data, but potentially these individuals do not know that their the kinds of content that they're sharing on these platforms could actually be signaling a deeper underlying psychological concern that they're experiencing that they may or may not know. How do we educate people about it? And how can we think about these algorithms in ways that could be not thought of as creepy, but to be thought of as ways that could bring help to people? Of course, there are questions about who should have access to these algorithms, right? Who owns this data? Who owns the findings or the outcomes that these algorithms are spitting out? So those are the questions whose answer I don't have, but those are the questions that I hope that we will be looking into going forward, because clearly we are seeing emergence of a new kind of data source that can tell us a lot about our health and well-being going forward in ways that have not been possible before. So on that note, I'm going to conclude, and happy to take any questions.
Time for questions, comments?
I have a lot of questions because I do research in this field, but I'm going to ask one question right now. So, in terms of design of interventions, right? I mean, it's, at least from my experience, it's not an organic evolution of sensing, right? Designing interventions has its own challenges.
Yeah,
not only efficacy is one problem, but then efficiency, they actually wash down over time. Even a good intervention loses power over time and people just throw it away. Or just the simple ability of getting access to them or awareness. There's a bunch of problems associated with designing the intervention, independent of when you discover. What are your thoughts about, like, this broad challenge of more like public health issues around interventions? Because those who go through the intervention actually get well, but there's, at least on my understanding, there's like more than 95% people who don't even get access and they don't even go through the intervention. Have you been thinking about?
So are you talking about the retention problem, or?
No, adoption, retention, dropout, all the whole life cycle of intervention, and authoring also, because it's like, engagement itself, it's a challenge.
Yeah. It's a very good question. I wish there was a one-sentence answer to that. But what I would say is the way I think about the uniqueness of using this data versus other forms of data is that social media platforms were not created for people to talk about health and well-being. They were just created because people want to say stupid things, right? We all say stupid things on these platforms. And they are already using those platforms to serve other purposes in their lives. And if we use the data from these platforms to build and deliver interventions through them, then I think that we have a better shot at making sure that these interventions are adopted and retained, because people are going to come there anyways. I mean, I can make an app and push it out to people. I always will have a question of, oh, maybe the person uninstalls the app because it's annoying, they don't like it, and so forth. But if it is on a platform where they're going to go to connect with their friends or to say what they ate for breakfast anyway, that's a good point to intervene than other standalone systems. I don't have evidence behind what I say, but this is what I hope is the case. It wouldn't be perfect, but hopefully it's a direction worth pursuing.
So I find the study of the subreddits particularly interesting. One thing I'm curious about is what you think you might find if you expanded your feature set beyond linguistic signals, like n-grams, and started looking at subcommunities, like which subreddits are they subscribed to or which subreddits were they posting in. In particular, I'm wondering if this could become a sort of moderating variable in your analysis, that like maybe like people who find certain subcommunities actually have a reduced risk of later posting in Suicide Watch, and others will have an amplified. And that might help get at this question of, does removing the hashtag from Instagram amplify it or suppress it? Like, you can imagine making arguments both ways.
Very good question. In fact, you're right. We are looking at that in a different project. We are trying to see who would go on to quit smoking or alcoholism going forward, looking at subreddits. And we find that participation in non-smoking cessation-related subreddits, like anything else on Reddit, actually predicts whether someone will quit or abstain from smoking or not. It's positively correlated. So we believe that they are actually finding other forms of support in those places that is helping them towards this goal. So yeah, looking at elsewhere on the platform can be super powerful to kind of get a more holistic picture of what's going on. Yeah.
So again, it's always a problem of getting access to this data, but what do you think would be similar or different if you looked at systems that are more about tracking like real world activities rather than just what people necessarily post, like Foursquare or like those types of location tracking things, or that kind of stuff?
What is the value of those kinds of signals?
Well, I'm just saying, so at that point, then you'd have some sort of real world data. It's a little bit still people doing impression management and trying to decide what to check in. But, obviously you'd imagine some signals like, people going out to, if people are exercising more, then you'd know something about their mental states.
Absolutely, that's a great question, and I didn't have a chance to talk about it, but one of the directions that I started to look at since getting to tech is how to bring different forms of sensing to work together. So, there is work in sort of wearable sensing and fitness trackers and whatnot that tell us about people's health and wellness, and then there is the stuff on social media. How can we marry the two? And also the third aspect, of course, which is people's health records or people's self-reported information. And that those other forms of data could help us fill in some of the gaps that exist while using only one form of data. So yeah, I mean, social media might be very much about impression management, but when we have those other forms of data to sort of interleave the social media stream, you can get a comprehensive picture about people's challenges and what's going on and so forth.
Do you think the data that you can collect and the methods that you run on the data will result in treatments that are better than what we already have? Because a lot of the current treatments we have aren't that great. I mean, it's like the intervention part is like pretty much unsolved for once we can clearly identify that someone has depression or another mental illness. So while it may be identifying lots of other individuals, do you think that actual treatment could be improved in some way?
Yeah, I really believe so. And I think that this kind of methodology and the findings could be incorporated in traditional forms of assessment. So for instance, the way psychotherapy today works is, for instance, I go up to my therapist, and depending on how severe my experience is, I'm probably going to meet them at max once a week, or if it's not that severe, probably once a month or once in 2 months, 6 months, whatnot. So the next time I go to my therapist, there is sort of this gap, right? The therapist would ask me questions. So how was your week, or how was your last 2 weeks? Did you feel lonely? Were you full of energy or not? All those questions. But we are prone to forgetting things, and it only gives the therapist coarse information about what may have happened in that 1 week. But now think about sort of diary-centric systems or reflective systems that the patient or I can now share with my therapist that, hey, this is what really happened. I posted these things on social media, so some kind of abstracted information about like trends, for instance, or other kinds of aggregated measurements about my behavior. So that kind of information, along with the questions that the therapist would have anyway asked, kind of empowers them with knowledge that can inform them better about what may have been going on in this person's life over the last 1 week than is possible just by asking questions. So I think it has.
My gut is kind of skeptical about that, to be honest. I think it needs to be studied further, like is digital information about someone that they didn't know was being tracked about them and is being displayed back to them in a psychotherapeutic environment, like is that actually a good thing for psychotherapy?
I know, yeah. I don't know. I mean, I always wonder about that question. What if individuals, I mean, now it becomes common knowledge 10 years down the line that yes, our data is used to track our mental illness. It just sounds very big brother and creepy and negative, but you can think of the positive aspects of it too, because if the data is presented in a way that doesn't compromise people's otherwise perceived privacy, then this kind of information could be.
Would it be effective? People feel insecure and like their privacy has been violated.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly don't know, but what I can tell you is that when we did follow-up interviews for our postpartum study, so we went back to some of the mothers who gave us access to their Facebook data, and we shared some of the findings with them. We got tremendous support. Of course, this is not generalizable. It's a specific community that struggles with these challenges, but we have seen tremendous support. We're also talking to a support group of moms who are trying to raise awareness about postpartum depression, and they seem to be very welcome to thinking about digital technologies that can help them. So this is an anecdotal tiny bit, but hopefully there are promising directions going forward to use these forms of data. Hey.
So this form of analysis seems really great. I'm curious about a comparison to Google flu trends. So, that worked for a while and then it stopped working.
Yeah.
And I wonder if there's a danger here that this kind of analysis will stop working. And, what do you think about that? And is there that danger?
So the Lazare science paper on why Google flu trends failed outlines two problems with it. One was the models were not updated based on the changing nature of the platform. So Google tinkers with its algorithm all the time. So when someone was searching for flu in 2009 and getting a set of results, that probably was quite different from what they were getting in 2013. And they failed to change them, adapt their models to how the platform had evolved. And of course, the type of people and their expectations out of a search engine also changed over the years. So they couldn't account for those two things. I believe the potential of this kind of work is not in kind of looking at a specific platform and building these models, but to think of it as one of the many signals that you can potentially look at while making these inferences. So that could be a range of different social media platforms. It could be social media and other kinds of data that would account for some of these changes over time.
When do you get to the point where you can act on these signals, right? If you're saying that we need to add in more and more signals from other platforms, then it's a little unclear when you can start acting on that.
Right. Yeah, the acting question is a very important one because honestly speaking, even though we have over 80% accuracy of our methods, it's great from an academic standpoint. It's not great from an actual intervention standpoint. So I think there are opportunities to figure out how we can improve the accuracy of these methods so that we can actually act on them. But also in the meanwhile, I think there's an opportunity to use them as ways to empower public health officials or other people who are making these decisions. So instead of sort of using them as a standalone system to act on flu or mental illness, use them as ways that the public health individuals could use to make those decisions. So I'm not saying, there's still the need of a human in the loop.
Yeah, but accuracy may go down, right? And we don't have ways of changing the models to make sure that we address the kinds of problems that Google.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot could have been addressed if they would have updated the models. No one really knows why they didn't do that. These kinds of things, these are the kinds of challenges that need constant tinkering and monitoring and figuring out what's going on. Like if we build a model and just let it go, it's obviously going to break. There's also the question of human interpretability in it. Oftentimes these models get so complex that if it breaks, it's hard for us to know what was that one feature that went wrong? So there are all these interesting questions that is not just about public health or health in general, but also about interpretability of machine learning, how to train people across domains to make these things useful. So yeah, I hope I had a better answer, but that's what I have for now.
My own devil's advocate here, because I sort of agree with you. Now, here's the part of me that doesn't. Let's say that it were a one-off model. If they were easy enough to create, is that such a bad thing where we could just target new models every time we needed to?
My question is more, is there a procedure for generating the new models? Like, how do you take into account the fact that the models need to change?
Actually, I have a follow-up question on that, because on my research on stress, you don't look at one live event, you look at 79 live events. And all of them are very complex. So just getting the linguistic model for one event is quite complex. Now, 79. So it blew our minds. So we started instead of doing regular expressions, a bag of words and that, we went into semantic models. So now we're doing semantic searching rather than, so semantic accounts for so many other things that weren't discussed here, like also like, just colloquial expressions of anxiety and depression. Some people say depression, but many of them just say, I'm feeling blue, I'm feeling down. There are so many ways to say the same thing. And if you look at people posting, we use LikeJournal.com as the baseline. It was really mind-boggling to just keep a model. So we're right now experimenting with semantic algorithms to see if we can use just semantic search or, of course, refine it. Have you been, like looking at semantic, type of, searching?
Can you guess what was the best predictor of postpartum depression? It was the usage of first-person pronouns. That's like the first thing we throw out in any NLP task. And that's because there is a long literature in psychology that says that high self-attentional focus is a good indicator of depression. So we were almost never looking into expressions of explicit depression because many times they didn't even know that they had depression. So looking at these otherwise conspicuous cues like usage of articles, which is less use of articles, that means that you're putting less attention to things around you. So you're kind of disconnected from the environment, and that's a sign of depression. So we found that many of these sort of low-level kind of linguistic attributes that we are not that conscious at the time of writing or sharing. I mean, who counts the number of I's and me's, right? That they were super powerful to get at that. So yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's just there are many challenges in that space to find what in the language we should be looking for. Yeah.
Final question, please.
Okay. You shared a lot about we can use these things for like early detection for the monitoring aspects and so on. But one thing that stood out to me was when you shared that sometimes these platforms, they try to shut down certain communities that are like engaged in harmful behaviors, and people are kind of like motivated to kind of go around that, and they have some process of doing that. Can you say a little bit more about kind of like the motivations? Maybe there's something known about why they do that, or how people, even like how that happens in the community, that they find ways around that, and maybe that would give us ideas of what we can do.
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually ongoing work that we are doing with Jacob Eisenstein, also at Tech, who's an NLP expert on linguistic variation. And we're trying to see, like, for the eating disorder study, like, okay, we see that these 5 variants come up immediately when this other tag is banned, but then how are they adopted and why these 5 variations? I mean, there are possibly hundreds of variations that are possible, but these 5 are the sticky ones. And who are sort of the early adopters of those variations, and how are people being influenced by these new norms and new practices in these communities? So there are many interesting directions to go about it. Right now, we don't know why this is happening, except that we find a lot of alignment with adversarial content detection and deviant behavior mining. So you would see this kind of a behavior when a spam filtering algorithm is put in place. The spammers find other ways to share spam now. So it's a cat and mouse chase. It happens in, let's say, platforms when they ban abuse-related content. People find another way to abuse each other. So it's just, I would say, innate in human nature to get around these kinds of third-party moderation practices, and mental health space is no exception. But there might be different norms or different kinds of community dynamics that are driving these practices compared to, like, say, the spammers or the abusers.
On that very positive note. Thank you one more time.
Thank you.